Perfect.
Oh. Okay.
Let's see here. I am. We're still just a minute away, but good morning to everybody that is here so far. Thanks for coming. I'll get started in just a minute to give more people an opportunity to join. Great. So good morning again. It looks like we have a few people in the webinar, which I want to thank all of you for joining right now. While others are joining, please take a moment to kind of poke around with some of the tools that are available, and I'll go over this again in just a couple of minutes as we garner more entrants. We have a lot of signups today, which is really exciting. Yeah, my colleague and the CEO of the Development Factory, this is her. You can't hear me, huh? Okay. Oh, okay. Let's see here. Yeah, let's do a little tech check here and make sure that people can hear. You don't want to. Great. Well, everybody has their own challenges every day. So cool. A couple more people getting on board. So yeah, I think it's time to kind of jump in. So, definitely welcome to all of you that are going to hang out with Suzanne and I this morning. So like I mentioned before, Suzanne is the CEO of the Development Factory. And I'll let Suzanne, maybe you can do a little introduction. Just say hi to everybody who's here so far.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I don't want to steal Brett's thunder. We've got a super exciting program today all about how to avoid product delivery hangups. I'm excited to learn from Brett, and I'm also here to lend some additional expertise and influence to the conversation. And I'll be moderating our Q&A and chat panel. So send me a hello, and if you've got questions, you can hit me up, and I'll be helping steer the ship here with Brett.
That's great. I wouldn't be able to do it without you, Suzanne. Thanks. Yeah, so if in chat today, if you ask a question, you're in good hands. If I don't have a chance to answer you on air, we'll look at getting an answer to you after the webinar. And Suzanne has a wealth of knowledge to share. So tons of product experience and has delivered a ton of products. So I think we're all in good hands with her moderating comments today. And as we go through the talk, I'll be answering questions, and that should help facilitate a nice community conversation here. A little bit about me. So my name is Brett Ulrich. I'm the managing director here at the Development Factory. A long history of building websites and web applications, products. I've worked in both the product management role, engineering management role, and project management role on a number of really impactful products over my career. And excited to kind of talk with the community today about some of the things and some of the ideas that I've brought to the table that are really bringing success to software delivery. So so as we're bringing more folks on, definitely look around the options that you have with the Zoom room. There is the Q&A feature, so definitely say hello to Suzanne over there and get comfortable. We will answer questions throughout, and then we'll have a little bit longer Q&A session towards the end. So a couple of assumptions about the audience today. So today's talk is going to be touching on Agile development and what Agile means and some strategies within Agile that people are using. So I wouldn't say that anything that we're going to talk about is advanced. It's more about kind of taking the general structures and pairing them with some of the experiences that we've seen in product development. So some familiarity there is going to be valuable. This also is a talk that we'll talk about projects. We're going to talk about projects and how to kind of dive into them and the mechanics on delivering software projects. And lastly, it is kind of a three-focused talk. So we'll talk about product and the management of products. We'll talk about engineering and engineering management. So there are some technical aspects of the conversation. Lastly, a lot about project management and how we think about project management here at the Development Factory and how to really customize an approach to help users achieve the outcomes that we set out for in building products. And one last cue on that, feel free to ask questions. Please, don't hesitate. If anything is confusing, we're here for you today. That's what this call is all about. So, and without further ado, I think I'll head on into some of the slides that we have here. Our outline today. First, we'll talk about customizing Agile. One of my favorite slogans and kind of one of my mantras is we want to fear the clusterfuck in project management. We'll talk a little bit about scope and feature creeping. And lastly, we'll finish with effective user stories. And that's one of my favorite parts of the conversation. The effective user stories are less about the mechanics and the structure, but I think after we go through the other elements, hopefully we'll all have a really great idea about the meaning and the purpose of really great user stories and how effective they are for business. And lastly, we'll have some time for question and answers. So to start this very first section, let's start thinking about customizing Agile. So Agile is an incredibly popular phrase amongst businesses, large and small businesses. It's been ingrained in software development for a long time. It's definitely mainstream now. Some of the problems that I've noticed with Agile and that are being written about today is that a command and control structure and a command and control dictation of Agile management doesn't actually work. And what we're seeing at larger organizations is Agile is coming from a top-down approach, and teams are unable to handle that sort of dictation. And so we'll touch on how Agile is really the choice of the team that's working on some things. And the other the other element, and this is something that I work on a lot, is that organizations really miss the cultural considerations when starting to undergo Agile. So, of course, organizations have a culture. The people within that organization either choose to align or stand in conflict with what that culture is. And it's really important that the Agile teams inside of the organization understand what their personality is, and that personality being equal to culture. So some of the things that we see happening today when we're looking at organizations and they're saying that they're Agile is they're taking a very standard approach to Agile management. They maybe are doing backlog grooming, sprint planning, daily stand-ups, 2-week iterations. They have a finite or a dictated number of points that they're trying to achieve throughout the iteration, and then an attempt to release at the end of an iteration. And this is a great place to start. It's not often where people end up. So one of my inspirational books as an application developer early on in my career is a book called Patterns of Application or Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture by Martin Fowler. And what I thought was wonderful about this book is that it goes through 51 different patterns for developing enterprise applications. And it's really the job of the engineering team to say, hey, we're building an application for X. Let's select X1, X2, X15 as our patterns to help put this software together. And the lessons that came out of that book really pertain to Agile development as well. There are a lot of different strategies that we have, a lot of different patterns that we can choose from. And we're advocating on our teams, and we're seeing success with this, that people really need to learn how to find the right mix and run with that on their software projects. So a couple of notes about the state of Agile and the state of Scrum. So Scrum is what I would call a classic Agile pattern. That very first example where I talked about backlog grooming, that's a very standard Scrum approach. So the State of Scrum 2017 releases an annual report. A 63% success rate is the project success rate on Scrum projects. Now, in the report, this is labeled as a success metric, but I really look at this as nearly 40% of projects are still failing, even with Scrum, which is supposed to be a really great way of developing software. Now, I'm not comparing that against some of the older methodologies of Agile development or just development, so it is an isolation, but I do advocate that we can do better. When you start looking at how we've mixed Scrum with other development methodologies, we see a lot of people are actually mixing already. So about 2,000 respondents on the survey that I'm citing here, 3.5 frameworks on average are being used when a team is not a Scrum-only team. So this is really interesting. So we look and we see things like Kanban, we have hybrid approaches, and I'll dive more into some of these definitions as we go along. But I think the point here is to understand that the world is really a mixture of best practices, and our teams depend on knowing what some of those best practices are. And then this further illustrates what we're seeing. So this graph is a trend. So if we look at 2017, we look at our Scrum-only teams, we look at our Scrum and other frameworks, and then we see no Scrum. And the trend is certainly higher. Teams are finding that they're having more success when they start mixing the different approaches. So what I'm thinking about, and on every single project that I get on, is I start thinking about the culture of this team, the goals, the outcomes that we want to see for the software. And in order to achieve all those goals, I use what's called an Agile pattern. So very much in the same definition of Agile, there's really one change here. And that is that an Agile pattern is a team's operational hypothesis. And I think that that's really important. Just like in all customer development and product development, we're really writing a number of hypotheses. And our job is to edit and change these as the product and the customers have decided that they like or dislike something. And it's really keeping an open mind and using some scientific rigor to be successful in our development. So now we can kind of take a step back. We can look at some classic patterns of development. And the important aspect here is if we look to the far left side of this slide, we're seeing prescriptive. So rational unified process is a very prescriptive way of developing software. And as we move towards the right, you see that everything becomes less prescriptive all the way until you get to effectively nothing. And I think some of the trends that I'm noticing and hearing thought leaders talk about on very highly effective software teams and what I'm advocating for and looking at constantly is really this space between Scrum, Kanban, and nothing might be an overstatement. We might want to look, and there's probably opportunities to look at how CI and CD fit onto this chart. Is there even a pattern there? But really the trend is to move further to the right. Well, understandably, larger organizations, teams that have been used to extreme programming, they're going to have a hard time moving directly to Kanban, and there's going to be pushback on your team. And everybody knows that when a team is not gelled and not getting along, that's going to be a huge anti-pattern to delivering value. So I'd like to focus on specifically Scrum and Kanban and some of the attributes of Scrum and Kanban and what that means for delivering. So as part of a definition here, Scrum has some prescriptions, prescribes a project or a product owner, a Scrum master, and also an implementation team. It resists change. It resists adding anything to the iteration. It uses estimation and velocity to dictate a capacity of work. So very early on, we said, okay, teams are dictating 16 points per iteration, and we don't go beyond that. We also dictate and prescribe a shippable release at the end of every iteration and a daily stand-up. And the chart on the right is a burn down chart, and this is very typical of a standard Scrum iteration. You can see as work starts to become developed and becomes accepted in the software, the amount of open points left to complete goes down as estimated. If we look at Kanban, we limit our work by what's currently in progress. It's far less prescriptive. So shippable releases are not tied to time. We're measuring things like average lead time. Daily stand-ups, of course, are not required because Kanban is less prescriptive. And one way that we can look at the data around how we're doing is using something we call a cumulative flow diagram. And this evaluates work in progress. You can see here, if you draw a line at any given day on a Kanban chart or a cumulative flow diagram, you can start to see where the bottlenecks are. And so in this example, we can see that testing is the bottleneck. Well, do we need more people to help with testing? Are developers just moving so fast? Do we need to maybe give developers some more work? Can we pull off some of that work that's in design or not started and hand that off to developers? That's how we start to evaluate our options. And so really what I look at every time we start to embark on a project is I look at, okay, our culture, our goals, and I start to decide where we want to be prescriptive versus adaptive in our framework. And this is something that teams definitely have to self-select. So the project managers, the engineers, the product managers, everybody needs to come to an agreement about how prescriptive or adaptive they want to be. We need to work to create custom patterns, and we definitely want to be open to change. Remember, this is a hypothesis. It's not set in stone. It's not concrete. We definitely want to change. Maybe we don't want to change too often. Every week, we probably don't want to be changing our process. That would dictate that we are in a situation where we're over-optimizing or over-engineering our engineering workflow. So definitely want to see how things improve. Here's an example of a chart that we can give to a team before we start, and something that we like to do is sort of hand this out to everybody on the team and say, hey, based upon this project, your ideas about things, please fill out and rate between 1 and 5 in each one of these boxes. And we'd say like a row is limited to 5 points total, right? So people will go through and they'll total up and say, well, yeah, I'm thinking in general, I'm probably taking a more prescriptive approach to this project, or a more adaptive approach to this project. And then we can sort of pick and choose, and we can look at how each individual row was rated. And then we can make a decision. We can start there with a hypothesis. I'm going to go through a couple of examples right now, but Suzanne, do we have a question that maybe I could answer before I jump into a few Agile pattern examples?
Yeah, we've got one from Andrew in our audience. You mentioned earlier in the conversation about CI/CD, but I don't think you elaborated on what that is. Can you tell us a little bit more about that particular approach?
Sure thing. I don't touch much on it in this talk, but continuous integration, continuous deployment is a set of software development principles that aim to combine the different code bases of individual developers on a daily basis. And it includes things like running automated tests and deploying pretty frequently. Basically, when code is approved and ready to go out, it is deployed. And actually, we see some of the roots of CI/CD come out in extreme programming. It's one of the tenets of extreme programming, which is a more prescriptive approach to software development. I would say that the standard CI/CD approach is prescriptive, and that helps us understand that just because a system or a team decides to be more adaptive, um, they might want to take some of the principles of CI/CD, but they might not want to put it into a 2-week iteration. And that's how you can start to kind of mix and match the things that you think are going to be really successful for a project. Some projects just don't work well with CI and CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment, simply because a lot of things need to come together before you can actually have a deployment. And one of the projects that I'll show here, we're going to talk about launching rockets. And obviously, you wouldn't be able to have a launch pad half built and a rocket built and then be able to launch a rocket into space. That would be a disaster for everybody. So I hope that answers your question, Andrew, and sparks others to ask some more. So some of the examples I'll go through right now, let's look at a course creation project. So something that we do here at the Development Factory is we create a lot of workshops and courses, and there are a couple of attributes with that work. So work can be done really in any order. What we'll do is we'll set up learning objectives, and then we'll fill in a number of the success metrics that we want to see in a number of the modules for the course. And those can really be created asynchronously. But we are limited by only a few things can be done at once. Obviously, if I'm trying to work on 4 or 5 modules at once, I'm going to be less successful than if I just grab one and really complete it. And so let's look at what maybe a workflow board would look like here. So if we are this workflow task board, I'll call the Agile School. This is an adaptive board. It's very reminiscent of Kanban. It is Kanban effectively out of the box. And so here we see a list of to-do items. I can pull a lesson here and pull it into in progress. And I've actually broke my own rules as just as an illustration here. So in progress, I have 3 items, but really I've limited my WIP or my work in progress to a max of 2 there. And then finally, when items are completed, we'll get a clear picture. The next slide we'll look at is more Scrum focused. So you can see This is what I mentioned before. We'll call this launching rockets. In this example, we'll say a board meeting dictates scheduled reporting. So maybe every 3 months or every month, there's an investor who sits on the board that meets with the executives of the organization, and they're really interested in their big investment and how the team is accomplishing their goals. And so there's maybe some rigid timelines here. One note, though, is that engineers do need the flexibility to kind of move things in and out of different workflows. And you can see in the illustration, we have in progress, development, testing, and tasks are actually able to move freely between the different columns. And at the end of each iteration, we're looking for a complete deliverable. So here's sort of a thin board. We've actually named the iteration here. So the iteration is called Get Rocket on Launchpad. You can see we have 10 days remaining in the iteration. And we have a couple of items that are moving through. So we've sort of launched. We have our final task here. I'm moving from right to left through the board. So this ticket is complete. We found a launchpad. Ready for QA. It looks like the team has built a launch tower, and we're waiting for the QA team to go and make sure that all the rivets are secured. And then finally in development, we have some folks that are measuring some rocket fuel. And of course, if you were really launching a rocket, there would probably be hundreds, if not thousands, of tasks on this board. And so another thing that I like to think about too, and this is the last example, is say we're purchasing third-party software. Well, how do we monitor this, right? This is a system that it actually has a lot of people involved and a lot of different hurdles that we have to cross before we can make a decision. Large organizations go through this quite frequently. So in this board, we'll say decisions, they need many approvals. Time is less of a factor, so maybe the 2-week iteration isn't necessarily the right choice, but tasks are definitely locked in an order. And to illustrate this, let's look at sort of a classic workflow diagram where you say, okay, well, we open a task, it goes into in progress, it's either rejected, maybe it's decided it's canceled, it goes into under review, and then it's approved and done. So what I like to think of here is, let's look at this hypothetical media company where we have a number of third-party pieces of software that we need to buy. And although it's not illustrated here, I would never be able to move anything in progress directly to done. There are a series of different columns that I must drag that task into. It's either going to be canceled, so we can see with canceled, our data warehouse partner, we decided that we didn't need that after all. So maybe it goes from in progress to under review. We might reject the proposal that we get from some of our third-party providers. If not, we'll approve it. But I would never be able to go directly from in progress to approved. I have to go into the under review section as well. And so this is a more prescriptive approach to how we send tasks throughout the organization, but yet it might not even find that same 2-week iteration that we have with a standard Scrum board. Maybe our iteration here is quarterly or annually as we decide to implement all this third-party software. So I think really the point here with everything in Agile patterns is that we're focusing on outcomes. We're looking at what is the project goal overall, and how does our right mix of development and how we decide to change that development process throughout get us there faster. One of the more important things I think here is that rhythm is more important than ritual. So ritual is definitely something that you might see in a more prescriptive approach, and some teams do really great with that, but it's all about everybody having that same rhythm. That's really what a gelled team is, and that's really where the most successful software delivery happens. There is no status quo. There are a lot of, I would say, pundits online who advocate one way or the other, or you must do this or you must do that, and it's really not the case. I've had successful Scrum teams launch really amazing products. I've had teams that had very little process at all also have very successful, very loved products. So another point here that I think is really awesome, and that is you want to be asking new team members when they join a team their opinions. And it's maybe not change that you'll implement right away, but it is important to have those data points because we're building trust amongst our teams and we want to find that rhythm. And when people have interesting ideas, why not learn from them? Even if we don't agree right away, or if we're never going to implement that process, having an open mind and taking that feedback is really critical. Um, what sort of questions do we have from the audience at this moment?
Well, Brett, selfishly, I want to jump in and ask one that's kind of coming up in my mind. You describe a lot of these different approaches that a team can take and in some ways advocate for the team to kind of arrive at what is that software delivery method or set of principles that works best for our organization. But if I'm an entrepreneur or if I'm a non-technical stakeholder within the organization and I need to participate or understand the software delivery approach, to what extent should I be learning this information? To what extent does it matter? You know, say my team comes to me and says, we've decided that extreme programming is the way that we're going to go, or, you know, we're going to use Scrum. Do I need to weigh in on that? Does it affect me directly? What are your thoughts on that?
It certainly affects you. It affects you in the way that, are we meeting the goals of your objectives? Are we affecting the bottom line inside of the organization? It also means that, so should you know about it and should you have vocabulary around what is being used? Absolutely. Any leader inside of an organization, any non-technical person that's leading a product, there should be a clear understanding about the choices that the product and engineering team have made about how they're going to deliver their software. And that gives us a place to start conversations if things start to go wrong. If everything is hunky-dory and beautiful, there isn't really a need to change, especially if everybody's happy and the customers are happy and we're delivering on time all the time. Maybe just that very first approach that we picked is satisfactory. But when things start to go wrong, if a deadline is missed, customers are encountering a lot of bugs in the software, then it's time to revisit the approach that's been taken. And if leaders on a project or inside of an organization don't have strong vocabulary around how the engineering team is necessarily doing their work, it's hard to inflict change or suggest change around that. And I think that this is equally, if not more important for executives that are outside the delivery process to have an understanding, because simply going it, we're looking at breaking down the walls between engineering and product teams and the business. And if those walls are low or non-existent, we're going to have a very clear understanding about what the goals are. You never want to walk into an engineering department and tap three people on the head and say, hey, what are the three most important things that this company does, and see blank eyes. Everybody should be able to answer that question. And the same goes for the executive team. How is it that you're able to deliver wonderful software? And they say, well, we used a mixed approach to development. We use some things from Scrum and some things from Kanban, and that helps us really be successful. So the next kind of part of this conversation, I want to talk a little bit about disasters, because it's hard to find success unless you've seen some disasters. And kind of coming up through my career, I've seen red flags early on, and sometimes I said things when I was, just an engineer, and other times I did not. And I encountered a piece of research, a book called Scaling Up Excellence, that was put out in 2015, that I think really touches on a very important aspect here, and that is that we really need to fear the clusterfuck. You can choose to say that word however you want as you walk away from this call, but I'm not in the business of alienating the audience that I don't know. So at any rate, the clusterfuck is really a combination of three things in projects. It's a combination of incompetence, impatience, and illusion. And not necessarily incompetence of the people that have embarked on the project, but clusterfugs turn great people into incompetent ones. I'll tell a little story that is expoed in the book, and then I have a personal story of my own as well. And so at Stanford in 2002, all of the accounts payable and a number of other systems, the HR system throughout the campus, was really a homegrown system. And the CIO at the time decided, with a number of outside recommendations from consultants, that Oracle Financials was the solution for them. And on September 1st, 2013, the project rolled out after being delayed for an entire year. The team was untrained when the current home-rolled system was turned off and when Oracle Financials started its rollout. By the holiday season, there were missing payments all over the campus, and it was determined that about 4,000 users of the system, both consumers and employees of the campus, were unable to do their job. They effectively became incompetent. There was a meeting with the faculty senate in February of 2004, and it was grim. It was grim for everybody. One kind of tale from the time is that the rollout team actually put a little punching bag on everybody's desk across the campus that was supposed to use this software. And when they weren't getting their support questions asked, they were supposed to punch on the punching bag to relieve their stress. And needless to say, that wasn't a very good solution. It didn't breed a morale booster for everyone. And by the time October of 2004 rolled around, after one more meeting with the faculty senate, the CIO decided that he needed to take a leave of absence and resign from his position due to family reasons. And so this is a perfect example of a project that I feel had a command and control approach and was dictated by a team that really represented the three I's: incompetence, impatience, and illusion. And just a short sort of story of personal experience. So I was involved with the organization Fullscreen for a couple of years, and as I was exiting, we looked at the subscription video on demand platform, and that project was recently sunsetted after a couple years, actually after 4 years of development, dozens of employees on the project. And really what had happened is it was always a loss leader. And I don't want this to be a lesson in non-experimentation, because businesses do need to take bets. That's all part of it, right? Fullscreen, I think, did kind of take a bet that didn't turn out accurately as this kind of their initial model said, but really they looked at it and they said, wow, thing is going to cost us $25 million to operate, and we're only bringing in $8 million in revenue. And one of the kind of points of this kind of clusterfuck, if you will, is that this project from the very beginning was architected for massive scale. They really had an eye on Netflix as a competitor and aimed to really build a system that could compete at that kind of scale. And sadly, they never found product market fit, and it really affected the organization as a whole. And so I think the point here is really we need to be starting smaller with our projects. So to combat the clusterfuck, we want to look at worry and self-doubt. Those are actually anecdotes. If you're worried about a project, you want to and you also want to take an approach of self-doubt. Like that's gonna help you have a different perspective than just, hey, gung-ho, let's build this thing. The other opportunity is a pre-mortem. And I'll kind of leave it at that. But the pre-mortem is a wonderful meeting where teams are split and people take different perspectives on a future success or future failure of the project. So moving through, I want to talk about a couple things around scope and feature creeping. I think we're all kind of familiar with the terms. What is scope scope creep. This is when things are added to a project that aren't needed or were never initially planned for. And really the point here is that as a project manager, you have one job, and that's to play scope cop. A couple of key points for managers and associates. Managers should really look to isolate new team members from requests. So this happens on software with bug fixes and sort of one-off quick fixes. Managers need to be really cognizant of their new team members' time, and this is a consequence because, or there is a consequence here of these requests because new people want to help inside of organizations, and a new person on a team is typically a victim of non-allocated requests. You want to allocate some time for tech debt and use strategies like OKRs to avoid rash decisions and distractions. From the associate side, definitely beware of client requests, beware of easy asks. Nothing takes 5 minutes in this world. You want to gain access and read statements of work and talk to team members. Really, you want to be talking to other people in the project and assessing, is everybody telling the same story? Some warning signs of scope creep. We're looking at missed deadlines. We look at team turnover. Also the inability to articulate a project goal. This is a thing that happens when a bunch of features have been added to software or a project changes. We start to lose sight of what the original kind of ideas were. So I think my favorite solution here is regular team meetings to groom financials. This kind of sounds like a Scrum team a little bit, right? So like every couple of weeks, you want to get everybody together and look at, gosh, how are we spending our time? What are we spending our money on? In software, we like to use initiatives. Let's use initiatives and not rigid deliverables. So now we're focusing on outcomes instead of a huge list of features. It's actually harder to add a feature to a project if you're always thinking about the outcome. If that feature doesn't match with the outcome, it creates a Boolean where you say that's really not going to help this outcome. Let's not add it. If you're just looking at features without that sort of high level overview, it's very easy to just shove extra things in. Also, open communication. One quick story that I have around an engineer and scope creeping is a person that I was mentoring, an architect, and the project was a little bit overdue. It was a hard project. It was a custom data warehousing initiative that we were doing, and he kept assuring me that I'm making progress. I'm not scope creeping, and I like this graph because this is actually a graph that shows how people learn. And as you're learning, you actually have these tabletops, and when you dive into a hard problem, everything starts to delay. And this was an instance where this engineer was in a trough, and to my mistake, I was certain scope creep was going on, and it took really a couple of hours, actually a day, for this person and I to dive into the code and really uncover that it's just a hard problem, and the person needed a little bit more time. Luckily, a couple days later, the smoke cleared, and up the trend we went, and we had an amazing tool and an engineer that had learned a lot on the project. Feature creep is a different thing. Feature creep is more specific to all of these features that we add, and this is really critical. This is a thing that we work with a lot at the development factory. We are really looking for customer satisfaction and making sure that our value propositions are spot on. And that's hard to do when there are a bunch of needed features. So one of my quotes that I like to say is, try to kill your idea every day. When it won't die, double your investment. I learned this through my ranks. Basically what we're saying is, is there an alternative that users are going to use? Like, do we really have something special here? Software is a really competitive space, and you need to have a special product to make an impact. And we can kind of tie this back to a basic business school principle, and that is the product life cycle. We're looking at sort of 4 columns here, and when we look at modern software and kind of how we think about delivering value in software, there are really a number of lessons that we can take away. in the introduction phase of your software, we're really just trying to solve a job. What is the job that your user is trying to do, and solve just that one job. After you have some traction, and we're looking at growth, maybe some other people are solving that job as well, then let's fill in the boilerplate. Then let's get really ingrained with user permissions and admin areas and extra features. And when we hit that maturity phase and we're competing against others in the marketplace really aggressively, that's when it's time to learn, or that's when it's time to really differentiate with a number of other features. But our products are really mature at that point. And finally, as we sunset things, let's take those lessons away. Take a screenshot of this slide. I love it. These are all the features that you probably can skip in an MVP. And there might be some conflict in the audience with some of these things. Like, for example, I say skip a desktop version and a mobile version on this list. Well, what do you have after that? Well, I think there's like a caveat here, right? So if you're building for desktop, start with desktop. If you're building for mobile, start with mobile. So here's what we're looking at, right? We're really looking at jobs. Now this is a strategizer graph. We're really looking at jobs and the gains and the pains that our products start to solve. Feature creeping. So to kind of close this section, let's demo limited feature sets with small customers or small customer sets. We want to create human fallbacks for missing features. So for example, if somebody needs to be an admin on the project, let's let the engineer just do that from the command line right off. If it happens 100 or 200 times a day, then it's time to build a feature. The last thing is understand the product lifecycle. Do we have time for a question?
Yeah, I think we have time. There was a question that came in a little earlier in regards to team size. So, recognize that it's probably more of an underpinning to all of this stuff that you're discussing. But what is the ideal team size for a group of engineers on a given product?
Well, it depends. Agile looks at multidisciplinary teams, and so we want to think about what we're building and sort of the key players that are required to get that done. There is a threshold, and the book that was written around this is called the Mythical Man Month, and that is that just adding more engineers to a project is not a dictator of success. And so if we're looking at a multidisciplinary team, what we want to see is that, one, all of the roles are covered, and if there is enough work in one of the roles that are needed to develop the project, maybe we need to add an additional person there. I like to start with 5. And so what that means is, do I need a platform engineer, a front-end engineer, a mobile engineer, a designer, and a product manager? And now I can start and I say, like, okay, well, those are my 5 people. It's multidisciplinary. Everybody on this team has the ability to actually deliver a feature. And then we can, as that being a base case, we can start to mix and match roles and add more people if needed. I've had teams as large as 12, and what starts to happen is we're looking at basically creating mini pods within those larger pods. And the 2 pizza team is something to consider there. There's a lot of research around communication channels and how communication does become more complex on larger teams. And there is some research to say that anything above 6 people on a team, communication starts to become hard to maintain. Kind of the last thing I'll touch on before we ask more questions as we go through are user stories. And I love user stories simply because of sort of the nebulous approach to them. They're different in every single project. They're different in every organization. But the idea of telling stories with one another is as old as humans, and that's really cool. And really, I like to define the user story as a place where problems meet problem solvers in delivering software. Some notes on bad user stories. Bad user stories, they create unneeded communication, they fail QA, they cost a ton of money, they create distrust, and they can really derail product value. One of the things that I think gets lost in a lot of projects, and when I'm mentoring project management, is this idea that a user story is really just a constant draft. It's always in a state of flux. Um, Even after a product or even after a user story has been delivered to the users, there's still an element of validation that product managers need to be thinking about. And so there are a lot of steps with user stories, and I won't go through all of them. I do have estimate here as a bordered line because that would be a more prescriptive aspect. And if your team is thinking more about Kanban, maybe they're not estimating user stories in a traditional point sense. But really, user stories are a draft. They are a constant conversation that an internal team is having with external users, and then internal team members are having with one another. And a couple of guidelines for good user stories. Is everybody on the team willing and able to understand what's happening in the user story? Is everybody on the same bus? This is a challenge with distributed teams. We want to make sure that the feedback loop is a little bit longer with a distributive team, depending on time zones. So being very clear in written communication is very important. Does everybody understand the system? Now, this is a job that I really advocate for engineering teams to do better all the time, and that is, let's demystify the system for non-technical people. As we break down the walls and say, hey, this is how our system operates, let's figure out how to teach this to people that are non-technical. That starts to increase the understanding of why certain things will take longer, cost more, should be reconsidered. And it's really understanding the system. And same for product managers. Product managers, they have a tough job to do in educating engineering teams on getting familiar with customers. There's a lot of talking that needs to go on. And really, if we're thinking about user stories, what is the user trying to do? What is the job that the user has? Then we start to find a common language and see the problems in alignment with each individual on the team. And let's build team trust through stories. So including even user stories that are developed for customers, let's build our own trust on engineering and product teams with stories. Let's tell stories with one another. Let's take time to work and get to know each other, all the better. One thing about trust is that it does occupy an unknown amount of time. It's never really certain how long it's going to take for a team to start gelling. Sometimes it happens really quickly. Other times it can take months. Some teams never build trust together. So if we think about good user stories are adaptable. They're easy to release, test, validate. There's a mutual understanding. Even if a customer were to come in and read a user story, would they be able to agree with what's written there? That's an important thing to think about. User stories should foster some collaboration on the team. And another thing is that we should make sure that value outweighs effort. If we have a really hard user story, we have a really hard task in front of us, is it really going to give us the kind of value that we need to be successful as an organization? And then finally, it takes a number of different questions to figure out when we're going to get stuff out. And we just have to keep asking them. And to close, user stories are definitely ever changing. Great delivery depends on gelled teams. It's really probably the highest indicator of success that I've ever seen. A team that can gel and can move together and anticipate how we're going to work together has a magnitude better chance of being successful than a team that is disparate. And then finally, even for your user stories, choose a prescriptive and adaptive mix. Some user stories are really prescriptive. As a user, I should do this thing so that, and that doesn't always work with every team. So really think about inside of your user stories, do we need a lot of rules to be successful, or can we be kind of willy-nilly and still make amazing things? And so with that, I think if there are other questions that folks have about kind of everything that I've touched on and kind of how we're thinking about product delivery here at the development factory and sort of best practices or any other things that I've learned along the way, this is the time. Let's open it up to others that might have some questions.
Yeah, so to our audience, if you do have questions and you want to jump on live, just go ahead and raise your hand. There's a little feature down in the bottom of the webinar screen. In the meantime, I'll ask you the question, Brett, which is, a lot of what you're saying seems to be, blending prescriptive and blending more adaptive ways of doing. There's an expression that I've heard through the years, which is the right Agile is the one that works for you. And I think that that's part of the root here, is saying don't get too caught up with any one best practice. Can you elaborate on that theme, if that's indeed what you're trying to talk about?
I mean, that really hits the nail on the head. I personally, in my experience and in the case studies that I've read and went through over the years, we're looking for the right mix of the right tools to create business value. So that's exactly it. And that really takes an open mind. I think it's very easy for somebody to kind of study a topic and pull away the highlights and build a brick wall with that. And I think that instead of building a brick wall, we should just take them as a number of ideas which could be successful today, but maybe won't be successful tomorrow. And that's important in delivering software effectively, is having just as much of an open mind about how we're going to engineer our delivery departments as we're going to engineer our products. All right, well, it's been wonderful to share all of this with you today. Thank you so much for listening. Very grateful to have an awesome audience today. This was our first coaching call here at the Development Factory. I'm excited that Suzanne and I are going to bring in more folks to learn about really what it takes to build amazing digital products in today's world. And so if you're out in the world and you are encountering people that want to build products, building products yourself, come to the Development Factory. We're here to help. We've done it so many times, and we've made mistakes along the way, but we are always getting better, and this is really what I think sets our company apart from a lot of others. So use us as a resource, and thanks again for joining me today.